Okay, everybody. We're just going to get started. Some people might drip in as we go on, but we should get underway. Thank you all very much for coming. Edinburgh's got a lot to offer on a Monday afternoon, so I'm glad that you all came here. I'm Morgan, just for anyone who's not met me before. It's my pleasure to introduce Yaron today on the topic of European Balkanisation, why Scotland should not be independent. For those who don't know Yaron, he's the host of the Yaron Brook show on YouTube, chairman of the Yaron Institute, all-round great chat.
Good. Thank you. Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, those of you here, last time I was here, we did something on art, so quite different this time. So it's always fun. So I understand Scotland wants a referendum on independence next year because I guess pretty confident they're going to win that referendum, and the Brits are saying no. The Conservative government in London is saying no, and this is going to Supreme Court to try to figure this out and whether this can be vetoed. And the question, I think, that bewilders my mind, and I don't know about what your views is why? Why does Scotland want to be independent? What value does independence provide Scots? For that matter, what does it really mean to be Scottish, other than the fact that you happen to be born in this part of the world? So what is the value of kind of separation? What is the value of creating another country? Is there something important Scotland wants to do that it cannot do with the UK? I mean, maybe, but is it a value? Value for whom? By what standard? How do we measure these things? What is the purpose of a nation state? Why should we have nation states? How many should they be? These are all, great questions. And to really think about how many should they be? Should there be Scotland versus the, Britain? Should there be? I've spoken, I think, in most of the Balkan states, but it always entertains me when I'm in Slovakia. I mean, how much did they benefit from not being part of the Czech, right? You're still tempted to say Czechoslovakia, but now there's a Czech Republic and there's Slovakia. Why? And nobody can really give you a coherent answer to that other than it makes them feel good. But the real funny one is if you go to Montenegro, which I don't know is about 400,000 people or something like that, but they're proud of the fact that they're not part of, I don't know, fill in the blanks, Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Croatia, and Northern Macedonia. Don't dare to call it Macedonia because Macedonia belongs to the Greeks and they won't let the Macedonians call themselves Macedonia, so it's Northern Macedonia. All of that used to be once called Yugoslavia, and that conflict is why we have the term Balkanization, which is a term coined a long, long time ago because of the many conflicts among the Balkan countries, each one to define its own little country, because my tribe should be ruled by my tribe. And it's shocking to me that this same kind of mentality, this tribal mentality, this tribalism, that inflicts the Balkans and inflicts many parts in Europe. Here in the British Isles, you see a very similar attitude. This is, to a large extent, one of the centers of the Enlightenment, one of the centers of the idea of some universal values. The idea of, human beings as sharing a specific nature and requiring a government not to splinter them, but in a sense to unite them. And here, to see it here happen, this separation, Balkanization, this tribalism, is indeed shocking to anybody thinking. So what is? I mean, to understand all this, we have to really think about what is the purpose of a state. Why do we have a nation? What is it that we're seeking by establishing a nation? And what's the purpose of it? What value do we get by creating a government? What is the role the government plays for all of us as human beings? And here I think it's important to recognize that as individual, independent human beings, the reason we want a government is not so it can run our lives. So not so it can infringe on our liberties, but what we want a government for is to protect our ability to live our lives as we see fit as individuals. It's to protect our liberty, to protect our freedom. I think the best example of articulating this is America, is the United States of America. And the reason for that is because the US was kind of conceived anew. It was a new country. Nothing existed there. I mean, it rebelled against, obviously, it rebelled against the UK. And it created this new political system. A new political system that was a result of the thinking that was happening here in Edinburgh, maybe some in London and some in Paris, but it was this thinking of the Enlightenment, and they created a new state, and they started from asking the question, what is the purpose of government and a state? You're not going to let me finish?
Native Americans were already there. You can't say there was no one there. Native Americans.
I didn't say there was nobody there. I said there was no nation there. There was no state there. There was no government there. There was no country there, right? Native Americans were there. But there was no government, there was no nation, there were tribes all over America. But there was no political entity. What they did is start a political entity from scratch. And therefore they asked the fundamental question of what do we need a political entity for? What is it supposed to do? And their formulation, I think, holds to this day. I don't think we live up to that formulation, but I think it's the right formulation. And that is the job of government is to protect. It's to protect our rights as individuals. That the unit of measure, the unit of importance is not the state, not the nation, not the group, not the collective, but the individual. That all individuals in their terminology are created equal. And the job of the state is to protect the liberty of those individuals. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to life, meaning the right for you as an individual to make decisions about your life and to act in pursuit of your life free of coercion, free of force, free of people telling you what you can and cannot do. Now, granted, they didn't apply it right, and they were far from applying it consistently, and in that sense, they were, the country was founded in kind of an original sin, which is slavery. But it's not just slavery, it's women, right? Women didn't have equal rights at the founding. But the idea that that is the purpose of a political entity, that is the purpose of politics, that is the purpose of having a government, is to protect us, is, in my view, the right idea. The purpose of politics is not to control us, but to liberate us, to allow us to live free of force. Human flourishing requires the ability of individuals to use their reason, their faculty of reason, in pursuit of their values, in pursuit of their life, in pursuit of their own happiness. And in order to do that, individuals need to be free of violence, free of force, free of coercion, free of crooks, criminals, gangsters, terrorists, invaders. The job of government is to keep us free, is to eliminate those elements from our life so that we can make the choices that are necessary for the pursuit of our own happiness and our own success. The fundamental unit for human beings is the individual. It's not the clan, it's not the tribe. Clans and tribes are just composed of individuals. And as an individual, each one of us has our own mind. Nobody can think for you. Nobody can make choices for you. It's your responsibility. You have a mind. You have the ability to make choices for yourself. So the whole way in which America was set up, at least, was to protect that ability of individuals to think for themselves and act for themselves in their own interests. And in that context, shouldn't matter who you are, where you come from, what the color of your skin is, what gender or sex you have. All that matters is your ability to live your life free as an individual. And the government is there to protect that ability. And in that context, once the issue of slavery was resolved in a massive, violent war, what brought unity to at least the United States was this idea of that is the role of government. Government is leaving us free. We're not collectives, we're not groups, we're not tribes, but anybody can come into this country. Anybody can come to this country, anybody can become part of this country as long as they live by these basic principles. This idea of, now we've got secession in the United States. There's still got talk of secession in the United States. We've got talk of, in a sense, Balkanization all over Europe. We've got Catalonia. You've got Italy threatening to split into two. You've got Russia invading Ukraine in the name of the Russian people, in the name of expanding, the Russian ethnic group, I guess, or protecting Russians in Ukraine. The whole idea of creating multiple nation states to protect little tribes is an idea that comes fundamentally from the rejection of the individual as the unit of measurement. Basically, what we're now replacing it with is some kind of tribe based on ethnicity, based on race, based on geographic location. What is the difference between Scots and English? Almost nothing. A different history. I'm sure you'd like to revive your old language. Why? English is perfectly good language. What reason would you have to revive an old, dead language? If language is there as a means of communication and ability to think and ability to express oneself, English serves wonderful purpose. There's no reason to bring back ancient languages for what? Because of the sound they make? Isn't it about communicating and thinking? Isn't that what language is for? But once the state starts moving away from the principle of protecting the individual, once the state starts divvying up goodies, once the state starts regulating, controlling, and redistributing wealth, once the state starts making decisions about how to control your life in the economic realm, how to control your life in the social realm, how to decide which speech is okay and which speech is not, now there are goodies to be had. Now there's loot to be divided. Maybe your little clan is not getting enough of the goodies that are being produced, or one perceive as being produced. Right? People start talking about, I'm not getting enough of the pie, of the national pie. Is there a national pie? The perspective is that there's a national pie and the Scots are not getting enough of it. Or the Welsh are not getting enough of it, or Northern England is not getting enough of it, or Southern England is not getting enough of it. But where does this national pie come from? This supposedly national pie.
Taxes.
Taxes? Who said taxes? Sorry.
Taxes, well, anything generating revenue coming to the country, tourism, those each things contribute to a country's wealth.
So taxes contribute to a country's wealth?
As well. I mean, you get taxes for, well, you're basically, it's a country.
Aren't taxes just a way of redistributing the country's wealth? The wealth already exists, and you're redistributing it?
The thing is, you're getting more into this pot, essentially, the way I would put it, mathematically.
So there's so the pie, from your perspective, the pie is what the government has, or the pie is what is total in society.
Total in society.
Then I would say taxes are just taking a piece of the pie and moving it to a different destination, but it's the same piece, right? The money's either there or it's not. The wealth is either there or it's not. But where does this pie come from? I mean, this is a completely collectivistic view of wealth. Where does this pie come from? Is there such a thing as a national pie? How do we get, so tourism, how do we get tourism? How does tourism happen? People come, right? They spend money here in particular businesses, right? Particular businesses make money. Some businesses are good and they make a lot of money. Some businesses might provide a lousy service, make a little bit of money. Some businesses go in and out of business. Some businesses thrive and expand. But tourism is just not some amorphous, abstract thing out there that people just respond to. Tourism is something that needs to be produced, a service that actually has to be created. Created by whom? By private individuals, by private companies and private individuals. Manufacturing wealth. Well, where does that come from? It comes from entrepreneurs building businesses, creating factories, employing people, creating wealth, or not. Some of them go under. Some of them lose wealth. But the national pie doesn't exist. There is no national pie. There is your pie and my pie and somebody else's pie. People create their own wealth. We're not, economists talk about, GDP, but where is GDP? Gross domestic product, right? Which is a proxy for how much wealth is created every year. But where is this GDP? Anybody point to the GDP? There's no GDP. It's just a mathematical way to aggregate what you produced this year, what you produced this year, and what I produced this year. There's no aggregate. The aggregate is just a piece of paper where people sum up the numbers. One of the things that happens, though, is once we start conceiving of your wealth and your wealth and your wealth and my wealth as belonging to the state or belonging to the nation or belonging to some collectivistic enterprise, well, now I'm a little worried. Why is my piece so small? Maybe because I haven't worked hard, or maybe because I'm not that productive, or maybe 1,000 reasons why my piece, maybe because I chose to be a university professor. And that will never grow a very big pie. That's just reality, right? University professors don't create a lot of wealth. But once we start viewing everything as this collective big pie, then people start wanting pieces of it. And people start complaining about other people's piece and wanting their piece to be bigger at other people's expenses. And they want to redistribute this pie. So people in South England seem like they're richer than people in Scotland. And wait a minute, they're getting a bigger piece of the pie than we're getting up here. That can't be right. Maybe we should get our hands on our own pie so we get to decide who gets the pieces of it. And there's always somebody who's motivated to tell you the story that if we get our own pie, it'll be bigger somehow. Let me tell you, it's almost certainly going to be smaller. Just Economics 101, it'll be a smaller pie. But there are people who gets to make the decisions about how the pie is allocated. Who gets to decide who gets what piece?
Government ministers.
Yeah, politicians, people in power. And it's immense power. I get to take your pie and decide how much to give back to you and how much to give to other people. That gives me a lot of power over your life, a lot of power over their lives, a lot of power over lots of people's lives. And the problem right now, if you're in Scotland and you're a politician in Scotland, is you don't have that much power. A lot of the power is in 10 Downing Street and in the House of Parliament in London. Power would be great. I want to be able to make more decisions about your life and about how to run you. I want to provide more favors to some people at other people's expenses. That's how I get my kicks. That's politicians. It's about power. So once government starts grabbing people's pieces of pie, well, wait a minute. I want to be in government. And I want to create my own government. I want to be able to do this. I want to be able to have control and power over other people's lives. And it doesn't just apply to money. It applies to all the kind of favors that government does today, all the kind of powers government exerts over our lives. I understand you have here in Scotland a much more robust anti-hate speech laws than the Brits do. Yeah, why let them control people's lives? Once you accept the idea that we should be able to control speech, well, I want to be able to control speech right here. I want to be able to control the speech. I want to be able to pass the laws to control speech. I don't want to leave it up to them. So in every aspect of control, the more politicians there are, the more power these politicians have. So all Scottish independence is really geared towards is providing a group of Scottish politicians with power over you that now reside somewhere else. So you grow the number of people in power and in control. And the way to sell it to you is, the economy is going to be better. We're going to make more local decisions on whose pie should be given to whom. You're going to have a greater say in government. Right. I mean, where has this worked exactly like that? And the more you divide, the more the less opportunities, the fewer opportunities you actually have to trade and produce and create and build and make and produce that pie and that wealth. So no, Scottish independence is just a form of a power grab by a group of your politicians to try to gain control over your life and your wealth. There's no value there. There's nothing to be gained. There's no profit in it for us. There's no more liberty in Scottish independence than there is where you are today. Probably less, given what seems like socialist inclinations of whoever comes to power in Scotland. Although who knows how it actually pans out, and who knows what's going to happen in London. You might see quite a shift to the left down in London in the years to come. But it's basically about power. It's basically about control. And it capitalizes on the fact that what we've been doing for the last 100 years, I think, particularly over the last few decades, is watering down people's ability or undermining people's ability to think for themselves. What we're undermining is the idea of reason, the idea of individualism, the idea that people can take care of themselves, the idea that people can manage their own lives. And we see this I see this in the US, where our educational system undermines the very concept of independent thinking, undermines the very concept of people thinking rationally for themselves. We elevate emotion, we elevate whim, we undermine reason. And what we then create are people who don't know how to think, and therefore don't know what values to pursue, don't know how to live. And when people are fearful, and when people are uncertain, and when people don't have the tools to think for themselves, they look for the closest group that looks like them to help them decide what to do, how to act. Tribalism is on the rise everywhere in the world. Racism is on the rise, I think, everywhere in the world, from both left and right. People associating themselves with people of the same color skin, people associating themselves with the same kind of heritage, people associating themselves with a group and abandoning their own minds and abandoning their own individuality. That is all on the rise as the idea of the efficacy of reason is in decline, as the idea of the individual's capacity to take care of himself and to live his life is in decline. And what politicians are capitalizing on, you can see this again in the US, even more extremely, I think, in some ways than you can here, is on that tribalism to create political power and to elevate themselves. But nobody out there, nobody on the political spectrum today anyway, is talking about those original values that I think justify the creation of the nation state. The idea of the individual, the idea of the efficacy of the individual mind, the efficacy of the individual's reason, the ability of the individual to take care of themselves, the ability of the individual to live their life, to produce and to build, and the role of the state as protector. What we have today is this mixed economy where the role of the state has been to redistribute. And when you're redistributing other people's wealth, that is very, very lucrative and very appealing to people who want power to grab a piece of that. So what we have today all over the world are states where people are constantly trying to grab a bigger and bigger piece of this pie, and what we're seeing is more and more and more conflict between people rather than harmony. Indeed, I think individualism leads to harmony. This group politics, this collective perspective on wealth and on power is what leads to disunity and fighting and the fragmentation. The balkanization is just one aspect of it. We live in a society that is fragmenting all over the world. And of course, we're living in an era where nationalism is on the rise. And nationalism is an ideology of placing the group, however you want to define that group, above the individual as a sacrificial animal to the group. The group is the fundamental unit, the fundamental political unit. And it's shocking that nationalism is on the rise, given the history, the bloody history of nationalism in the 20th century and before that. But you're seeing it all over the place. And again, the prime example of this, I think, right now is obviously in Russia and Ukraine, where a war that is primarily motivated, or at least primarily, what would you call it, talked up on nationalistic grounds. It might be about resources, but the way to motivate people is not, oh, we're going to get the natural gas those Ukrainians have. The way to, motivate people is to tell them about the greatness of the Russian people and the greatness of Russia and the need to unify the Russian people and to build the Russian Empire and the importance of Russia historically, all mystical gibberish. But again, in a society where reason is out, evidence is out, logic is out, where emotions are primary, this all makes sense and people are willing to fight, or at least some people are willing to fight for these kind of causes. Maybe the best thing happening right now in the Russian-Ukraine thing is the resistance from within Russia. That is, the people who are leaving, the people who are resisting, the people who are objecting to what is going on. Maybe we'll all see the irrational nakedness of this nationalistic tendency, but I think that's way too optimistic to believe that. Nationalism is on the rise again in the US, obviously here. You just saw populist nationalist winning in Italy, populist nationalist winning in Sweden, and you're going to see this sweep throughout Europe. As we become less individualistic, as we denigrate the capacity of human beings to think rationally, as we make the individual dependent on the group more and more, the group becomes more and more important, and then it's just a question of which group you want to associate with. And that's what we're seeing, at least throughout the Western world. What's the cure? The cure is a return to individualism. The cure is a return to a proper role of government. The cure is never to think there's such a thing as a national pie. There's only individual wealth. Your wealth is not mine. My wealth is not yours. The cure is individualism and the role of the state in protecting our rights. The cure is capitalism, a system that is based on individualism and recognizes the fact that wealth is created by individuals. It's not collective. capitalism, a system that does not believe the state should control our speech, not believes the state should control any aspect of our life, except when violence is threatened against us. The state has no role otherwise in our lives, but should leave us alone, free. And the funny thing is, that kind of atomized, what people view as atomized, that kind of leave you alone individualism is what brings about harmony. The most peaceful eras in human history are eras where capitalism thrived. Whether it's from the Napoleonic Wars till 1914, or whether it's in the post-World War II era, when trade, individual freedom, individual liberty was relatively respected, not as much as I would like, but relatively respected. When individualism, freedom, capitalism reigned, we actually lived for the most part in peace. I fear that the direction the world is heading today, the war in Ukraine is not going to be the last war we see. It's not going to be the last violent conflict we see, as nationalism, collectivism, and tribalism replace the ideas of individualism and capitalism. Thank you. I'll take questions.
You're up. Can you just read the questions back as well, because otherwise they won't go.
Sure. If there are any. About anything, yeah.
Just to say, great speech reading that. But was that? I was just going to question on. So when you talk about balkanization, now nations have always been formed. Do you not think, that nations have always been formed on the basis of groups of people who identify with each other, and how that's sort of something that I think we can't necessarily get around and stop, even if sometimes it must be wrong and it is wrong. But I mean, would you say not in the sense of Scottish independence, it's perhaps the idea of Scottish nationalism may be rooted in an idea that Scots are more distinct from the rest of the UK, when in fact really the ideology maybe should be that we're British together. And our differences in terms of our individual nations aren't enough to make such distinct tribes. And perhaps it's the rise of that individual tribe of say Scots, English, Welsh.
But this is the challenge, right? So I don't know. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was just supposed to resign, right? Where's he from?
England.
Is he?
Well, Cosy.
Yeah, Cosy. Where's Cosy from? Is he British in the ethnic sense? In the sense in which we differentiate between Scots and Brits and Welsh? I mean, where's he from? I don't even know where he's from, right? But the color of his skin suggests that he's not British in the genetic sense of the word, in the ethnic sense of the word. So I don't know what it means to say that nations are formed through the fact that people are similar. And even if they are formed that way, immigration shatters that and forces us to rethink what a nation is and what a nation should be. Certainly it's true that in history nations are formed out of tribes, out of the mergers of several tribes. So a state is usually a specific geographic area that is, and the state is formed from a collection of tribes. But in an era of immigration, and I think immigration should be and is a right that we all have, in an era of immigration, what does it even mean to say that a nation is a collection of tribes? What about all these immigrants coming in from all kinds of new tribes, right? So what we need to get away from is an ethnic view of the nation state. What we need to get away from is this idea that an ethnic state needs to be a unity of people who look alike, or people who come from the same genetic background. I mean, that is an old form of collectivism. We call it really racism, that we need to abandon. But it is racism. We might today use the word ethnic in order to round out the edges, not to make it too harsh, but it's just racism, right? No, to properly be a Scot is to be somebody who's living in Scotland and has, embraced, I guess, the life living in Scotland. And it would be a shame if you required them to have that awful accent that you have. But it's, you know, and again, I think America is a good example of this. To be an American is not to be of a particular ethnic group. I mean, that would be absurd in America. To be in America is to live in America. And it would be nice if we had unity. And the unity should be, ideally, around a particular political philosophy. It shouldn't be around, you know, a dogma that people have preached. But the idea, it used to be in America, at least to some extent, right, that unity was around this idea that we are free, that America is the land of the free. People defined it a little differently. It wasn't clear exactly what you meant. But generally, there was the sense that to be an American, you believed in freedom, individual liberty and freedom. Don't tread on me. That's gone. That's shattered. And now what has happened with that shattering is you've got this disunity. You've got these groups fighting each other because freedom is out. What does it mean to be British? I don't know, but that's something that needs to be defined. Is there something that can unify the British people? It would be nice if it was liberty, if it was again freedom. But to now create a separate Scotland, what does that add? Because the Scots have slightly different genes than again, but you're getting into racism, which is a very, very primitive form of tribalism, which is a primitive form of collectivism, which is all, you know, we're in the 21st century, we should be beyond these kind of distinctions. Yeah.
At the start, thank you very much for the talk.
Sure.
At the start, you said Scotland wants independence. That was how
Yeah,
you wrote it.
yeah.
But of course, the last time we were asked in 2014, most Scots didn't want independence. By Scots, I mean people living here.
Yep.
So you know, people can hear from my accent. I'm British. I'm English by birth.
Yep.
I was living in Scotland in 2014. Yep. And what's interesting to me is that referendum and the conversations that went on around it, which I actually quite enjoyed. I think a lot of people were far more engaged in politics than I've seen for a very long time. I was teaching here in Edinburgh at the time, and I would say that year the students that I was working with were far more politically engaged than I've ever seen before or since, and I think that's a good thing. But the conversations that were going on around that time, we were told it was about that was the referendum of a generation. It's only 8 years isn't really a generation. But I suppose what I'm wondering is why those conversations, which were productive, lots of big issues were being talked about, and I think it was important they were talked about. Why was it that it wasn't solved when so many people did engage and did think well and did have some of those issues out? What stopped it being an understanding that would last for a generation?
Well, I think two things. One is the success of the SPN, right? You've got SNP. You've got a political party dedicated to one issue, which is Scottish independence, sweeping Scotland. I mean, winning pretty much every seat. And basically what that gave them, they felt, is a mandate to revisit the issue, right? So you guys, they interpret it as, you guys have changed your minds. Because it's not that that they are that different, let's say, from Labour or that different from the Conservatives. You have all those choices, and yet Scots voted overwhelmingly for this one political party, and it emboldened them. And then, of course, the second is their own political interests. They want independence because, as I said, independence will increase the power they have, will give them a boost to whatever chemical inside their brain gives them satisfaction from controlling all of us, right? They have less of that. They were only members of parliament in England, but here they would actually run things. So I think it's a combination of two. You, and I don't mean you particularly, but the Scots gave them power, gave them an indication that you wanted independence in spite of the referendum, and you were feeding an animal that was already ready for it. So they all their incentives are aligned to want another referendum with the hope that it passes and they gain more power. Now, I'm skeptical about, I have to say, I disagree with you on one thing. I'm skeptical about these political debates. It's sad to me that we have to be so involved in politics. Life shouldn't be about politics. Most people should be able to go about their lives and never think about a politician at all. The only reason politics has become so important and crucial, and we need to engage, is because they're in our lives, in everything that we do. Everything that we do today has a political aspect. I mean, even now, I don't know whether you call yourself a male or female is a political issue, which is absurd and ridiculous. But the more politics intervene into our lives, speech, into how we live, into our relationships, into our businesses, the more we need to become political. But I view that as sad. I would like to live in a world where politics was, life is difficult, complicated enough. Politicians, they have their job, let them do it, and leave us alone. But they have taken on the whole responsibility. They've taken on, Plato's philosopher king. They want to run things for us. We're too stupid to run our lives. We're too stupid to figure out what's appropriate and what's not, what can be said and what can't be said. And they want, and we've given them the mandate. It's not just them as controlling us. We've given them the mandate to control us. And we have to watch them now because they are in our lives in every aspect of it.
You say to the argument that having more smaller states is something that allows for people to basically vote with their feet and move to the country that offers them the most freedom?
So what would I say to the idea, I think, that comes out of certain libertarian thinkers, that if you have a lot of small states, then you have more opportunities to vote with your feet. You can move to the country that's more free, and it gives us more options and more possibilities. I'd say even today, right, with the limited countries that we have, it's very difficult to move with your feet. Just try emigrating to the United States right now. So we have massive limitations in immigration. If you multiply the number of states, you're not going to loosen those restrictions on immigration. You're still going to make them very, very tough and very, very difficult. So I'm all for open, I'm all for open borders. I'm all for people immigrating. I think immigration is wonderful. I think the possibility, people having the option to choose the most free place is good. But I don't think you get that by multiplying, by creating more states. Scotland is unlikely to be freer by being independent than Britain is. It's unlikely that that's the motivation driving the Scots. If Scotland actually declared, we want to create a more free country, we want to respect individual rights. The problem with London is that they're redistributing too much wealth, they're taking from people, and they're interfering in people's lives. We want to be free. Then I'd support it. Yeah, here. But that's not what they want. They want to create, this reminds me of, this favorite movie, everybody's favorite movie, Braveheart, right? And in Braveheart, Wallace and everybody else is yelling, freedom! What century is this?
14th.
What's that? 14th. Okay, something around there, right? What's the conception of freedom that Wallace has, or any of these people have? What do they mean when they're yelling freedom? What do they mean?
From the English?
From the English, as opposed to what? I want to be ruled by a Scottish king. I want to be oppressed by a Scottish king. I want to be taxed by a Scottish king. I don't want to be taxed by a British king. I don't want to be ruled by a Scottish king. They still want a king. They still want to be oppressed. They just want somebody to oppress them who looks like them, who has the same bloodline as them, who, speaks with the same accent as them. That's all. So, it's not a freedom movie. It's a movie about, one tribe fighting another tribe over power. That's all. There's no freedom there. Freedom means the freedom as an individual to act free of coercion, free of force. It doesn't matter who the king is and where the king comes from. Kings are bad. Kings are unfree. Sorry, King Charles, but kings with power. So I don't see this multiplicity. In the Balkans now, you've got all those countries that I mentioned, right? I think I mentioned all of them. Any one of them stand out over the others as being more free? And not necessarily. I mean, they're all about the same. They all oppress us about the same. They're all the same kind of mixed economies. But I get to be with Montenegrins, right? And he gets to be with Kosovo, whatever they call it themselves, right? Who cares? That's the beauty of immigration, is you get to leave those people, right? And so I would like to see more immigration, but I don't think you need more countries for that. I would actually like to see less. There's a huge, I didn't mention my talk, but there's a huge advantage to having fewer bigger countries. Huge advantage, and that is that you have larger areas, geographic areas, of more people under the same rule of law. It makes trade easier, it makes production easier, it makes relating to one another easier. If there's one governing language, if there's one governing system of laws, it makes everything beneath it. Now, assuming they're free. If they're not free, then it doesn't matter if you're being oppressed by this particular king, that particular king, or a big king that rules the whole area. So size doesn't matter when it comes to oppression. Yep.
You may have just spoken to this a little bit, but arguments against individualism frequently, what you said that collectivism leads to, which is atomization, balkanization, and disunity.
Yeah.
So could you say more about how exactly the individualist approach leads to unity over collectivism, given that the same arguments are often...
Yes, because so an individualist approach, both as an individual, and then we'll talk about it as politics. But as an individual, if I'm an individualist, what do I care about? I care about my own happiness. I care about my own ability to live my life as I see fit. I care about pursuing my values and my happiness. What you do with your life is not relevant to me, unless you're interfering with me, unless you're using coercion or force against me. Right? I am focused on achieving my values. I am focused on succeeding in my life, in gaining the values I believe are necessary for my individual flourishing. So my orientation is not towards the other, it's towards self, and towards progress, and towards achieving what's good for me. So I think you get a lot less envy, you get a lot less jealousy. I don't look at the other guy saying how much he's got. I'm looking at me and thinking how much I want and how am I going to get it. Not relative to him, but relative to me, relative to my potential, my ability, and what my desires or wishes are given who I am. Right? So, one of the astounding things about America, the way it used to be, I think it's less and less today, is that as individualistic a country as it was, things like envy were very rare. So people didn't look, for example, at wealthier people than them and say, oh, I hate that guy because he's got more than me. They looked at somebody who had more than them and say, hey, I'm ambitious. I'd like to live in that house, right? But not in a sense of antagonism, but in a sense of ambition. Whereas if you go to cultures like, Scandinavia, there's this, if you stick above the rest, if you're a little bit different, if you have a little bit more, people will key your car, people will express this real animosity towards you. I think that's changing in Scandinavia, but at least that's I forget the name of it. They have this name of the Scandinavia rules where you're not supposed to be different. You're not supposed to stand out. Because everybody's looking at each other and comparing themselves, whereas individualists don't do that because they're too focused on their own success and their own happiness. Now, politically, individualism leads to a system politically that basically protects the individual's life and protects them so that they can live their life based on those values. It protects them from violence, but otherwise leaves them alone. So the state then, politically, is not taking from you and giving to him. It's not redistributing wealth. It's not allocating resources. It's not deciding who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, except when it comes to criminal law, except when it comes to you violating somebody else's rights. It leaves you alone. So I have no business with the state. This is my point about politics. Today, the state taxes this huge amount of money, and then it sits there, and it basically goes, who am I going to give this to? Come beg. Come lobby. Come ask, right? I know there's a bunch of nonprofits here that consult, I've been reading this, consult the Scottish government on all kinds of things. The latest hot thing is gender issues, right? So there are these nonprofits. So each nonprofit is trying to figure out how they can get the most money from the government and what they need to tell them. And are they going to tell them the truth, or are they going to tell them what's going to get them the most money? if you're a university researcher, this is a great example of how this works. Like if you're a university researcher and you're almost always going to get money from the government to do your research, and you get money from the government to do your research, and at the end of the research you say, everything's great, everything's cool, things are wonderful on planet Earth. Is they ever going to get money again? No. But if you tell the government, oh, I'm researching this problem, it looks like there might be really, really bad stuff happening in the future. Could I get some more money to keep researching this? Then of course you're going to get money. So there's a tendency to catastrophize because catastrophes get money and other things don't. If you're a particularly ethnic group, you want to emphasize or belong to an ethnic group, then you want to congregate with your other ethnic members and go to the government and claim, oh, we need reparations, or we need this, or we need that, because there's a pie to be distributed. But under capitalism, on individualism, there's no pie to be distributed. Your pie is your responsibility. Nobody's going to give you anything. So there's no motivation to keep grabbing, to keep going after more and more and more, and to create this conflict, right? So what kind of the state involvement in the economy does is it creates these pressure groups that are constantly fighting over the resources that are being taken by the state and now can be divvied up. And again, those resources are not always just monetary. They could be just control.
So the individual is more likely to, rather than, say, grab for what someone else has, to emulate their behavior so that they might arrive at the same outcome.
Or figure out what would lead to the best outcome, right? So it's key that individuals have the capacity to think, the capacity to reason, to discover a proper path. Somebody else does something doesn't mean to emulate them. You might want to do better than them. Or you might want to do something completely different. They're not the standard, you are the standard.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll go there and then back.
So, a common thread throughout your talk was a look at collectivist tendencies. So like the view of framing wealth as a national pie, or with nationalism, racism and conflict on the rise at the moment. So this question is kind of like a challenging of your assumptions on human nature. Could having collectivist tendencies be a feature of human nature, and could the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment world be a blip on the train of history that we're coming off?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems that way if we look at history, right? Human beings are being, with the exception of a few brief periods in history, human history is filled with conformity and tribalism, and people aggregating around groups and following the leader and not thinking for themselves. And I think in that respect we're still a young species. So I think we're yet to learn from the mistakes of our past. No question that if you look at history, collectivism dominates. But if you look at human achievement, you look at the periods of history in which we have achieved the most, then by far it's not even a comparison. I mean, the reality is that about 100,000 years from the beginning of Homo sapiens, basically we did almost nothing as we stayed in tribes and as we stayed as collectives, and it's only in the last 250 years that certainly when it comes to wealth creation, almost all the wealth created by human beings in history is being created in the last 250 years. And that is a consequence of a shift that the Enlightenment brought about in the way we think about individuals versus collectives. And a focus on individualism has created this massive boom. Yeah, we can abandon that. We have choice. But we will also suffer the consequence of that. And we're already starting to suffer the consequence of that, with slow economic growth and lots of economic problems. All of that a consequence of the fact that we're moving away from an individualistic perspective, at least economically, and adopting a collectivistic perspective. Is it human nature? What does that even mean to say it's human nature, right? So human beings have the choice. They can choose to rely on their own mind, they can choose to rely on their own decisions and be individualist, or they can choose to shut off their mind and follow a leader, or follow a group, or follow something, or follow their emotions. That's a choice. And there are periods in history, most of the time, that we choose to shut off our mind and follow a leader. Or We're so poor, we don't have the time to engage with our own minds, so we follow the leader because we just don't have the time, right? We were really, really, really poor 300 years ago. So who had time to think for themselves? You basically worked, and you slept, and you ate, and that's it. Not much more than that. We have the luxury today to do a lot of thinking. And that's what the tragedy is, that we're doing a lot of thinking, and we're banning thought, and we're following leaders, and we're following, we're conforming, we're accepting what people who look like us tell us we should think. But no, human nature gives us the capacity to choose. Now, is there something about being human that wants to relate to other people? Absolutely. That we're social in that sense, right? We want to relate to other people, but how do we relate to other people? Do we relate to other people as mindless nothings? Do we relate to other people as rulers? Do we relate to other people as serfs? Or do we relate to other people as equal individuals who we trade with? And the appropriate way in which to relate to other people is through some form of material or spiritual trade. It's you give, you get. And you benefit from the production and the ability and the wonder that other people create and that the lives of other people represent. So in that sense, nobody wants to be on a desert island all by themselves. Right? That's not what individualism means. Individualism means that you're responsible for your own life, you do your own thinking, and then you engage with other people as a trader, not as a victim and not as an oppressor, as a trader. Yeah.
So you asked a rhetorical question at the beginning. You said, why Scotland wants independence?
Yeah.
And you started talking a part about being able to take our own decisions, about having local governance. But can you really say that? Because one of the main arguments of the Scottish independence movement is to leave the United Kingdom to join the European Union. So does that really make sense? Because there's a contradiction, because they want politicians in Brussels to rule over them. So I wanted to know what do you think of that argument? Because it's very unlikely that the UK will join the EU again.
Yes.
The Charter has ruled out.
Even if they suffer dramatically for it, they will not join the European Union again. It's a one-way street. So there is a difference between London and Brussels. And it's an important difference, because it's an important difference that leaves Scottish politicians with a lot more power vis-a-vis Brussels than they have vis-a-vis London. Brussels has a lot of regulations and a lot of controls, but Brussels doesn't have a monetary unity in a sense of authority over taxes, an authority over redistribution of wealth. Brussels doesn't control free speech. It has certain recommendations about these things, but every country does their own thing. There's a lot of respects in which Brussels leaves countries independent to do a lot of things, right? And that when you are part of one nation, London doesn't, right? Now, there's some autonomy that Scotland has, but it's limited. So if you're a politician and what you really want is power, you're much better off with the European Union than you are with Britain. Now, will Scotland join the EU? If it does, probably, because the economics of Scotland leaving Britain are so bad, are so horrific for Scotland, they're going to have to find somebody to have free trade with, because they've just lost the most important economic player here, right? So, and my guess is that Scotland is a net beneficiary of the pie, not a net contributor to the pie. Scotland is significantly poorer, for example, than the south of England. So, I think joining the EU is something they will do, but it still leaves them with enough control. And this is part of the whole issue of Brexit, and whether Brexit was a good thing or a bad thing, is if once the UK left Brexit, if it maintains all the controls that Brussels imposed on it to begin with, then what was the point of leaving? Which is what's happening, right? Since they left, has Britain taken away any of the regulations imposed on them by Brussels? No. I mean, Truss promised that, but now all Truss's promises out the window, so that's gone. Boris Johnson certainly wasn't going to reduce any of the regulations. Indeed, he imposed new regulations that went even further on things like climate change than Brussels did. So again, it's all about control at the end of the day. It's not about, it's all about control. Brexit is all about control. And a lot of why British politicians wanted Brexit is they wanted to rule Britain. They didn't want to share that rule with Brussels. We can imagine it's for liberty and freedom and sovereignty, but it doesn't look like that. It doesn't look that way from the way they've actually acted. It's a nice story they tell. Again, it's a story to get us to support them. Oh, we'll have national sovereignty. We'll get rid of all those bureaucrats in Brussels. We'll do the right thing. We'll change everything. We'll liberate. We'll reform. And then when it happens, nothing changes, right? Except now you're not part of the European Union, so your cost of living goes up because you're buying European goods and you're paying a tariff. Exports out of Britain are declined because nobody wants to buy your goods because they have to pay a tariff. So it's an unmitigated negative given what the government has done. I mean, I was like, my opinion of Brexit was it depends what you do with it, right? If you use it to do the right thing, it could be cool, it could be fantastic. If you don't do the right thing, then it's a disaster. And so far, disaster. Yeah.
As both private citizens, I ask it as both private citizens and in like an academic context. You said earlier that the solution is individualism. How do we move towards that as people? That might be what we personally believe is the ideal, but how do we move as a society towards that?
Well, I mean, it's not a simple process because I think that in a sense what we need to do is resurrect a lot of the ideas that have kind of died when the Enlightenment has died. I think the first idea that is really, really important, particularly in educational context, the first idea to resurrect is the efficacy of reason. The fact that reason is our basic means of survival, it's the way in which we know the world, it's the way in which we can understand the world, and it's how we survive. It's what makes us human. Like I speak all over the world to audiences and I ask people, what makes us human? And people come up with the craziest ideas. But it takes a while for somebody to say, we can think. At the very basic level, we can think. Animals can't. And people say, we feel empathy. Really? Empathy is what makes us human? More important than thinking, abstracting, creating, building, doing things that are completely new? No animal can do that. That's what makes us human. Or people say communicating. True, but what facilitates communication? Thinking, conceptualization, having concepts. So it all starts with reason. And if we teach children that their emotions are more important than their thoughts, if we don't teach them how to think and we don't give them content to their thoughts, if we don't teach them history, if we don't teach them math, if we don't teach them science, and I think the UK is a little better than the United States, but in America it's a disaster education. John Dewey, the American philosopher, was very influential in education in the US, was very focused on education as a form of socializing people, not as a form of teaching them facts and how to think. So that is the first thing. We have to return to a society, a culture of reason. We have to elevate reason back to where it belongs. There's a great quote from Thomas Jefferson in the Jefferson Memorial about, bring everything before reason, right? Even the existence of God, something. So reason is our way of knowing what's true and what's not. Nothing else is. So that's the first thing. And then the second is we have to challenge, and this is a whole other topic, but we have to challenge the pervading moral code that exists in our society. The moral code that says that morality is about, and solely about, how you treat other people. And that to be moral is to negate your own interests for the sake of others. And we need to resurrect an Aristotelian view of morality, where morality is how to live the best life you can live for you. That is how to achieve eudaimonia, how to achieve happiness, how to achieve success, how to live a good life. And how you treat other people is part of that. But it's not all of morality. Right? Morality is about how to achieve a good life, the good life, right?
I think it's sort of bouncing off what you're saying. I think more what I meant is, in terms of things like a culture of quite violent and aggressive censorship, how do you move towards challenging status quo and things like that? Because I know that you're an individual that faces a lot of backlash, but a lot of people it's really intimidating and scary. And how do you begin to overcome that when you lose jobs, you lose job opportunities, you lose scholarships?
You have to fight back. I mean, it's your life. There's no other life. There's no other place. I mean, or you immigrate to a place where you can speak. But if you're going to stay in a place, you have to fight back. You can't let the censors win. And particular, I mean, this thing about cancel culture, in particular when they don't really have power over you, where the power is social acceptance or just your classmates being nice to you, screw them. You've got to speak up. I mean, this is life. You know, everybody says, well, J.K. Rowling can afford to speak up. She can afford not to be silent. But we all can afford that. We all need to be brave on whatever issue it is. And again, there's no real alternative because there's no alternative life you can live. And if speaking is important, and it is, if cultural change is important and it requires speaking, then you just got to say, this is the one thing that I'm willing to, I don't know, to go up against whomever on, is my ability to speak. Because once you give up speech, you're giving up thought. And once you give up thought, you've given up life. I'm far more relaxed about giving up my money and having them take X percentage of my wealth or control other aspects of my life than my speech. Because my speech is my thinking. My speech is my mind. And to give up my mind is to give up everything. So it's absurd what's going on in American and British universities. And I blame the Americans because they seem to have started this and exported it to the UK. There's no question it started in America. I remember the first time I went, because for years in the UK you could pretty much say anything. And I remember the first time I went to Oxford and I was told I couldn't say stuff. By the students would tell me in a lecture, you can't say stuff like that. And that was the first time I realized that it come from America, because that was already in the States. And it starts at the best universities. It always does that, right? It always starts with the best, right? And their prestige then gets it filtered in the way you advance in academia now. Again, academia is very conformist. The whole field of academia is conformist. The way journals work, the way peer review works, it's all geared towards conformity. I mean, often, and I come from, my PhD is in finance, so it's in economics. It's not kind of in the social sciences, but even in finance, all of the real breakthrough articles were published in B-rated journals, because the A-rated journals, it was outside of the accepted, right? You only publish the accepted stuff, the sophisticated accepted stuff, but only the stuff that conforms, the really outlandish stuff, the stuff that's really pushing the envelope, is out here. Right? And you see that, you see how conforming academia becomes, and it all filters down from the top academics. They make a decision. I was reading about Alzheimer research and how for 30 years, Alzheimer research, there's one hypothesis. The top people in the field decided this is the only hypothesis worth testing. It's the only right hypothesis. This is the amyloid theory of stuff. And that's all the money went into that. All the publications went into that. All the academic talks at conferences went into that. Turns out it's wrong. We've lost 30 years of research on the most devastating, maybe the most devastating disease all of us probably fear, which is the loss of our minds as we get older. Maybe we'd have a cure today. And now, finally, they're starting to fund a lot of different things and trying different things and experimenting and taking some of the radical, crazy ideas that some academics had in the past and researchers had and putting money into it, and we'll see what happens. But academia, even in the sciences, is very conforming. Remember, Einstein wrote his breakthrough papers not in academia, right? He was a patent clerk at the patent office, and he wrote it outside. Yeah.
just trying to follow your logic here. So,
Sure.
For individuals and the collective, as in politicians are taking the pie, and we don't like that.
Yeah.
But following that, surely that's a pro-independence argument, because right now there are two sets of politicians eating that pie. There's Westminster and Scottish Parliament. So with independence, you only have one set of politicians eating that pie.
Well, to the extent that, yes, to the extent that you have this ridiculous system where you've got some autonomy here in Scotland, and that is true. The question is ultimately, given that you, particularly in Scotland, you are probably getting some of the pie from England, not the other way around, because more wealth is created down there than up here. So the flow is probably in this direction. In order to compensate for that, your Scottish politicians are going to have to take more of your pie in order to do what we've all given them a mandate to do. So that even though it's now two pies, I think the Scottish one pie is going to be larger in terms of the cost to you as a Scot than the two pies are today. So it's not a question of how many pies, it's a question of the ultimate size, how much it costs your wallet economically. And I think one Scottish pie is going to cost your wallet a lot more than two pies that exist today. I mean, whether it's true or not is a question. Does that make sense?
I get where you're coming from.
Yep.
There's debate as to who's paying who more. Because the English say they're paying more, the Scottish say they're paying more. But you're a financial issue.
I mean, I'm not an expert on the economy of Scotland and England, so I'm not sure. My senses and what I've read is that the wealthiest part of the United Kingdom is the south of England, and generally they, to some extent, subsidize the rest. But I don't like that way of looking at the world at all, right? Because I don't like the whole idea of collective pies, and I'd like to throw that out in the trash heap of history. So I don't do those. I don't spend too much time doing those calculations and figure out. Although I do it for my personally, right? I try to minimize my taxes. I try to minimize how much is taken from me to that collective pie. That would be my focus as an individual. That's why I live in Puerto Rico. Yeah.
Just similar question to Molly's about how the mechanics of actually implementing some of these ideas worked. But more in a political sense, perhaps. So just thinking about, say, Liz Truss as become Prime Minister, she spoke quite a lot about reducing bureaucracy, reducing taxes, and kind of tried to implement that. Maybe only half of it, perhaps, but I just wondered if you could speak about maybe some of the...
Yeah, so it brings up a lot of issues. I mean, I'd say one thing you can learn from what just happened to Truss is she's not attuned to the people who elected her. Or the people who elected the Conservative Party, put it that way, not who elected her. The people who elected the Conservative Party don't want economic freedom. They did not vote for Boris Johnson because they thought he would bring them lower taxes and less regulations and more economic freedom. They elected Boris Johnson for a variety of cultural issues and partially to slap down the left. There is no constituency either in the US or in the UK for liberty, economic liberty. What there is a big cultural dispute about all kinds of cultural issues that have nothing to do with economics, that really are the way we differentiate the left and the right. But there's no, it's not like the Conservatives are saying, oh, we're gonna privatize the NHS. No, I mean, if anything, the left and the right are competing on who will provide more funding to NHS and grow it even bigger and make it more powerful, right? It's not like the right wants to massively deregulate and create a free market, and no, they don't. Now, maybe Elizabeth Truss does, maybe, I don't know. But her constituency who voted for her don't. The people who actually voted Conservative in the last election that gave Boris Johnson a landslide victory voted for him because he said he wouldn't do that. That he'd keep a lot of the regulations, that he'd keep a lot of the controls, that he was as green as the left was. There was competition between him and the green. Who would build more windmills? Right? There wasn't like an opposition to building windmills on the right. So I think let me finish and then so what Elizabeth Truss did is she got ahead of her own party. That is, she went in a direction that I don't think the people who voted Conservative actually wanted to go. then she made two other mistakes. One is just awful communication. God, if you're going to propose something controversial, a little bit radical, a little bit different, then have your communication plan ready. Know what you're going to say. She went on TV and blabbered. She didn't know what she was talking about. The exchequer guy, I forget his name. You know, they didn't know what they didn't have. And markets want to hear confidence. They want to hear you say, you know, okay, we're assuming a Laffer curve. We're assuming that actually tax revenues will go up as we cut taxes. Laffer curve is real. This is you know, I don't argue that way about taxes, but they could have, right? Because it's a collectivistic way to talk about taxes. But they could have, but they made no argument for what they did. So communication. If you're going to do something radical, and then third, you cannot cut taxes on everything and not cut spending and tell people you're never going to cut spending. That is insanity. That is unserious. Nobody takes you seriously if you do that, and that's what the market responded to. The market responded to the fact that that this government wouldn't deal with the real elephant in the room, which is spending, which is excess government spending, and the same in the United States, the same in all these countries. If you can, Republicans are very, very good in America cutting taxes, and what does it get them? Nothing, because they don't cut spending. So from a purely economic perspective, it's spending that needs to be cut, and the markets know that, and the markets reacted. You know, plus you've got a bunch of real structural problems with the way the pension system is built in the UK and the way the derivatives markets function in the UK that you've got to realize the problems, and you've got to have a plan on how to deal with them, other than let the Bank of England step in and pretend that they're heroes by buying up a lot of debt. So all of this, it just wasn't thought through. They just didn't have a plan. Yeah.
Just a quick point on Boris Johnson's overwhelming mandate.
Yeah.
He actually got 42% of the popular vote, but because of the vote system, it's 55% of the seats.
Interesting. Okay.
So, you know, most people voted left, either left or central, but because of the first part.
Because of the way it's, yeah.
A lot of it's America still.
Yeah. Yeah, but even the 43% that he got, right? A lot of those votes came from the Northern England working class. They're not there for free markets. They were there on cultural issues. They were there for Brexit. They were there for all kinds of things, not for free markets. There's just no constituency anywhere in the world today for free markets. Capitalism is dead for most people. So that's the reality that we are struggling against. But you can see it in America. Donald Trump didn't believe in free markets. The Republican Party today doesn't believe in free markets. They just are not the left. That's the greatest virtue, that they're not the left, and that's what they run on. That's what they run on.
I think affluence is a problem.
I think affluence is a problem.
The necessity to keep surviving, keep trying, disappears, and follow a generation doesn't really have any incentive to keep going, and the generation after that just assumes it's all going to be okay and cruises on. And this sort of lack of ability to function properly and rely on the state seems to me to be tied to affluence, and maybe that's a problem.
But it's not like countries that are not affluent are doing any better. It's not like there's a huge movement towards freedom and capitalism in Bulgaria or in Romania, which are countries that are still struggling from the legacy of communism and are not affluent. And most of the people there wouldn't be defined as affluent by our standards. Or for that matter, you're not seeing a demand for liberty and freedom in Vietnam. Yeah. So, which is still quite a poor place. So no, I don't think so. I mean, certainly affluence gives you the opportunity not to suffer the consequences of your own irrationality and laziness. So yes, so an affluent country can be stupid for a long time. And that's what we're experiencing now. The West is super stupid, and it can last a long time. So one of the frustrations is there's a sense in which I want it to be over already. I know the West is in decline, but I keep saying that, and like you keep predicting financial crises, and they don't happen, or the end of the dollar, or whatever that some of these financial gurus predict, right? And you know it's going to happen, but it could take a long time because we're affluent. And not only affluent, you know, we have a base of capital and a base of knowledge that is so substantial. We can milk it without producing really any new innovations for a long time. And to a large extent, we're doing that. So it's super frustrating. In a sense, you want it to, you know, you want the bad behavior to lead to bad results. So for example, I believe that the UK or the American economies can grow realistically at 4 to 6% GDP growth a year. I think that's real, right? You can go for, now that is, right now they're going at 1% a year. That 3% difference sounds like nothing. But if you extrapolate that over 40 years, it is massive. And it's massive in particular for poor people. Basically, if you take a low-income person today, and if the economy grows at a 4% real rate over the next 40 years, and that poor person, assuming their wages grow at a similar rate over that period of time, which they typically do, they are earning well into the figures in real terms in 40 years. There are no poor people in the UK and in America if that happens. If we go at 1%, they're better off, but not that much. That's the beauty of exponential growth. But how do I convince people of this? That it's really, really important to grow at 4%, that we could solve all our problems if we grew at 4%. Because they seem content with 1%. Again, this is just simple economics. And our agenda is much bigger than just simple economics. We can't even convince them of simple economics. They'd rather have the comfort of growing at 1%, which they won't because at some point it'll shrink, than take the risks associated, the risks of individualism associated with growing at 4%. And the tragedy is unbelievable. I mean, if the United States had grown 1% GDP less per year over the last 100 years, it would be poorer than Mexico. 1%. That's the kind of benefit you get from every percentage of GDP growth.
Yeah, I think that's also the benefit you get from individuals functioning.
Yes, well, but that's what it's from. Individuals pursuing, you know, individuals creating companies, individuals being entrepreneurs, individuals, you know, pushing the envelope in every realm because they want to live the best life that they can live. They're ambitious. It comes from ambition.
That's those who are losing. You get government.
Yes.
And you get very few people doing anything.
Yeah.
It's
and think of all the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people at universities who are doing mindless work. Sorry. And they're pretty smart people. They could be incredibly productive. They could be actually teaching something valuable. And they're just churning nonsense. Nonsense on steroids that get you nowhere and telling you what you can and cannot say and telling you what you can and cannot do. And that's deflating everything. Deflates exactly that spirit that is required to achieve anything economically. Yeah.
Anecdotally, again, speak about the things you can and cannot say. Next door is a meeting of the Pro-Life Society, which is a big problem on that. But these protesters have just gone in to start a fight. So they're right through that wall. It's happening right now. So anecdotally, it just made me laugh as we were saying that. It's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I find, you know, I am a pro-abortion, but people who are anti-abortion have a right to speak their mind. It should be allowed to speak their mind, and it's absurd not to allow them. You know, and on many issues, my views are much more radical than their views on abortion happen to be. And if we can't speak, what can we do? You know, and this relates to this idea. You know, if you can't talk about stuff, then the only way to convince somebody else, the only way to change other people's minds is by force. So the only two alternatives in the end are violence or free speech. And the more we reduce free speech, the more we'll increase violence. And again, I think we're going in a direction of a more violent world, of more conflict, not less conflict, because of these intellectual trends.
You were speaking about improvement being in the long term, and terms of making a short-term prediction, do you think that the balkanization movements will win, or do you think that they won't be successful?
Well, I think in the end it's going to depend on the local context. Like Catalonia clearly wants to be free of Spain, and it's interesting. Catalonia, the pie is going clearly in the other direction. Catalonia is super productive, and to a large extent, people in Catalonia feel like they're subsidizing the rest of Spain. But Spain won't let them, right? So if Catalonia votes, they'd probably vote for independence, but Spain just won't even, they've arrested, I guess the governor or the mayor. So I don't think it's going to happen in Spain. I don't think it'll happen in Italy. I don't think there's ever been a serious attempt to separate Italy into north and south, even though, again, the pie flows in a particular direction there, from north to south. I'm trying to think of other places where there's an attempt other than Scotland. And generally right now, what's rising is nationalism, but even the nationalism that's rising, the people, once they get power, you see this in Italy. Italy is a great example of this, right? Every few years there's an election, quite frequently in Italy, and a populist party wins. And they promise we're going to put the EU in its place, we're going to do an Italy exit or whatever it's called, and then they get into power and they don't. And they don't because they know that they can't afford to. They won't have any power if that happens. They'll be running they'll pull themselves into a massive financial crisis if they do it. So they play along with the EU, and then they lose the next election to the next populist party. The populist says the same thing. So Meloni has rhetoric, anti-EU rhetoric, but now she's completely, aligned with the EU. So I think right now, in the shorter run, you're going to see stability, and you're not going to see a lot of balkanization. I don't know what's going to happen in Scotland, but at least in Europe, I think the war in Ukraine has kind of woken people up to some of the dangers associated with fragmentation. It's right now, just for self-preservation, it's better to be together than to be separate. The fact that Sweden and Finland are joining NATO is pretty indicative of, even the Swedish Democrats, Christian Democrats, I guess they're called, who are the populist party in Sweden, are not going to oppose joining NATO, even though they've always spoken against NATO in the past, because there's a real threat. I actually think that in many ways, this war, as awful and horrific as it is, will actually wake people up in certain respects to the dangers of nationalism, at least in the short run, of real nationalism, the kind of nationalism Putin reflects, versus the kind of nationalism in Italy, which I think ultimately they're pragmatists, and they're just gonna be like every other political party in Italy in the past. Yeah.
You hear occasionally things about this kind of phenomenon in America called kind of national divorce or things like that. Do you think that has any traction to it?
I don't think there's going to be secession in America. And look, this is the problem America has is, let's say you're Texas, right? And you want to, let's pretend Texas is Republican, they want to secede. 45 to 48% of your population are not Republicans, of your population in Texas. That is, Texas is not 90% Republican, 10% Democrat. Austin, Texas, the best city in Austin by far, best city in Texas by far, and the most thriving and energized and dynamic, is Democratic. Overwhelmingly, it's not even close, right? So if there's a civil war, it's not going to be between states, it's going to be inside states, right? So I think the secession movement, and the same in California, you could pretend that California is all Democrats, and yeah, they have a majority, but I don't know, 40% or not. It's not a trivial number that are not. And so California secedes, they kick out all the Republicans? Is that how it's going to work? So the mechanisms of it are going to be very, very difficult, and particularly if they need super majorities in order to secede. And then the U.S. has to allow them to secede, and there's a big... So I don't see secession as an issue in the U.S. What I see generally in the West is just the decline. Just everything becoming slower, less dynamic, less interesting, culturally less interesting, economically less interesting. Everything's slowing down into this kind of stagnation, and economic, cultural, intellectual stagnation. And partially it's attacks on free speech that make this, partially it's the economics that are just devastating economic growth. And you're already seeing it. You're already seeing kind of everything becomes duller and grayer and stupider. I mean, the debates now are pretty stupid over the issues people seem to really care about. And I think that's only going to become worse, not better, and on both sides. And the risk ultimately is, at least in the US, and I'm not sure exactly how to think about this in terms of Europe, but in the US the risk is more authoritarianism, because that's what happens, that people become dissatisfied, unhappy, frustrated, wanting change, because they know it's bad, but they don't know what the solution is. And this is what you're getting, like the Trump voter is upset and frustrated, and in many respects justifiably so. And they don't know what the answer is, and somebody comes to them and says, I know what the answer is. It's not you, you're great, you're fantastic people. It's those other people. It's their fault. They did it, and if you trust me, I'll fix it all. Now that's the rhetoric of authoritarianism. Now Trump couldn't do it because America's not an authoritarian country yet. But imagine somebody more charismatic than Trump, imagine somebody more effective at manipulating the system than Trump, but with the same kind of rhetoric. That's what scares me. Because the more frustrated people become, the more accepting that their life is a dead end, that they can't achieve, that they can't be successful. The less dynamic our world is, the more ripe it is for authoritarians. And I see them rising in the US. You see whole intellectual movements now dedicated to illiberalism. They're literally calling themselves illiberal right. We already know of the illiberal left. Now we've got massive numbers of illiberal right, whether they call themselves national conservatives or just some of them just call themselves, some of them basically just theocrats, particularly Catholics in America, who want complete religion and state merger. Right? I think that's, if you had to lay out a scenario for the U.S. where it's heading, probably heading in that direction more than it is in any other direction. Although again, how it all plays out is going to be hard to tell. I have this vision of the future dictator of the U.S. who combines the key elements of left and right to create a true populist kind of thing. So you have to have the flag and you have to have religion. That's the right. And then you bring in something like environmentalism and class warfare from the left, and you wrap it all nicely into a nice bundle, and you sell that. Remember that, National Socialism was National Socialism. It was a combination of nationalism and socialism. That's how you unite the left and the right. And a lot of radical leftists joined Hitler's project because, at the end of the day, it wasn't that different than their project. So. You just need to package it right. You need the right personality, and I think that's the real danger. And I don't know enough about Europe to have a sense of where it's heading and whether ultimately the EU breaks up. It might, but I think right now, in the short run, it's going to hold together because of an external threat. External threats always bring people together. It's a good thing or a bad thing. They bring people together. Yeah.
A different type. Why do you think the appeal to emotion over the appeal to reason has captured the popular imaginary in the way it seems to have done, and the appeal to people to position themselves as vulnerable over the appeal to people to position themselves as successful? Why is that captured? It seems to me fast swayed, particularly in younger people.
Yeah, that's a big question. But so I think this is a process. It's been going on for a long time, really, since the end of the Enlightenment. I think there's a philosophical battle, right, in our culture between the ideas of the Enlightenment and really the ideas of German Romanticism. And the German Romanticism is chipped away and chipped away and chipped away and chipped away and won. And what German Romanticism really highlighted through Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Marx, ultimately, is the fact that reason is impotent. That was their push, right? Kant divorces reason from reality. So he makes reason into, in a sense, something you just do in your head, but it's not really connected to the world out there. That's a vast simplification, but that's the essential of what he does. And then you can go in all kinds of directions at that point, because once you divorce reason from reality out there, then it's basically impotent. It means nothing. One of the reasons that it's so enticing is that it basically captures the spirit of Christianity, right? Christianity is fundamentally anti-reason, right? It's faith. And in an era where people were giving up Christianity, reason is pretty demanding. Reason requires you to engage, to think, to take responsibility, to do stuff. In swept this alternative ideology that basically accepted the mysticism in a different form of Christianity without, and let you off the hook in terms of actually thinking everything through and taking personal responsibility and figuring all this out. And now there's a million variations of this kind of Kantian view of reason, right? That have just taken a naked approach to it's all inside your head. I don't know. I did one of my episodes I did on Dugin. Dugin is one of Putin's one of Russia's big philosophers, right? Whether he advises Putin directly or not, he's one of the big philosophers. And he said, Dugin says, you create the world out there. The world doesn't exist. There's no objective reality. Well, that's it. It's all over once you accept that. And what do the trans activists say? There's no reality of sex. It's all in your head. You can do whatever you want. You can imagine whatever reality you want. And sexual reality, gender reality. You can imagine whatever you want. I mean, whatever you think about gender, that's absurd. You don't create your gender in here. Ignoring biology, ignoring reality, ignoring the physical world, right? So we've shifted from a focus on science, on reality, on the efficacy of the mind, and once you clearly show that, or once you suggest to people that is ineffective, that is bogus, then what are they left with? They're left with emotions. That's all they have. And then the philosophers who capitalize us on this directly, Dewey in America, clearly says, this is 100 and something years ago, that the purpose of education is to socialize. It's to teach students to express themselves emotionally. Right? So you have kindergartens kids sitting in a circle, and the teacher asks them what they think of Trump. Well, the key there is they don't think. They're kids. They don't know what they think of as the solution to the Middle East crisis. They don't know. They have no clue. They're kids. So you're encouraging them to voice opinions about things they don't know anything about, which is common in our society. We're constantly asking people to comment on things they have no concept about. With all the problems with experts in COVID, the bigger problem was non-experts who thought they were experts. And everybody became an expert in COVID without doing any research, without knowing any statistic, without knowing any immunology, without knowing anything about medicine. Everybody became everybody had an opinion about COVID. They saw a video, 2-minute video on YouTube, and they had an opinion about COVID. So, we've turned people into these emotional, and so what was the second part of your question? That was about the emotionalism. So I think it's that philosophical, that anti-Enlightenment philosophical trend that rose up primarily in Germany, but was already in the Enlightenment, because you already had Rousseau in the Enlightenment, who was already anti-reason, already rejecting reason. And that battle continues, and they won. We lost. So, it's a philosophical battle that affects every branch of knowledge there is. That's what philosophy does. It infects every other branch of knowledge. And at the Courts of Christianity, you asked about intersectionality in a sense. Why are we competing on who's being more oppressed? Right? Well, again, Christianity, right? There is an entire, the entire ethical code of Christianity is built around the association of virtue with suffering. Suffering is virtuous. The meek shall inherit the earth. Mother Teresa, when she went to India to help the poor, she didn't help them become not poor. She helped them not die so they could continue to suffer, because suffer was virtue. I mean, you can read her diaries, and you can read, Christopher Hitchens has a great book on Mother Teresa. And it's awful what she did, because she didn't help them achieve success, because success is non-Christian according to that interpretation, right? So we have an ethical code that is focused on the more you suffer, the more you are owed. The more we owe you. And that goes back 2,000 years. We've just morphed it into, okay, well, let's make this a science. And we'll categorize your suffering based on your race and your gender and your sex and your whatever, right? So they're just being scientific about the moral code that exists in our society already. Right? Well, I mean, we have a welfare state because some people are owed because they suffer, because they're poor, and other people have, and therefore it's okay to take from those who have and give to those who haven't. Everything in our society is built on a moral code of otherism, of altruism. And altruism doesn't mean just helping people, because we all love to help people. Nobody has anything against helping people. Altruism is the code that says that your primary moral focus in life is other people. That is their well-being, not your own. And indeed, if you think about yourself, you're not moral. That's Auguste Comte and that's Kant. Both argue that if you think about yourself, oh, I like helping other people. That's not moral anymore if you like it. The whole point is the suffering. The whole point is the sacrifice. So that moral code needs to shift. Right? And nobody has presented an alternative to Christianity in ethics. Nobody has presented an alternative to Christianity in ethics other than Ayn Rand. There's Aristotle and there's Rand. Maybe Spinoza, but there's nothing. Everything else is Christian morality. It's secularized. And that has to be challenged. And until we challenge it, we're doomed. Yep.
What are you optimistic about?
What am I optimistic about? Ultimately I'm optimistic about the human spirit. I think that people can change, and I think there's the possibility of change. I'm optimistic about individuals. I'm not optimistic about countries or the culture right now. I think there's very little to be optimistic about. I'm optimistic about the fact that we do have ideas that are better. We do have ideas that can change the world. There are solutions. We know what those solutions are. So it's just a matter of communicating. It's a matter of convincing. It's a matter of arguing. It's a matter of and I do believe that'll win in the end. I think it'll take a long time, but I think the better ideas will ultimately win. I'm optimistic about particular areas, technological areas. I'm optimistic about biology and biotech. I'm optimistic about a lot of kind of particular sciences and particular innovations that are happening. But it's hard to be right now optimistic about politics and about the state of the world. I mean, I'll tell you, I used to be. I mean, there's a long time. Call it naive, but I was pretty optimistic about China. From about 2000 to, I'd say, 2015, I went to China many times, and what I saw in China were people really focused on making life better and producing and living and oppressed for decades, and suddenly they got a little bit of liberty, and they just exploded with productivity and innovation, and the cities just blew up, and people who were basically extremely poor suddenly were middle class, and they expressed it, and they were joyous, and it just had this vibe of a great place, both culturally and economically. And yet, they instead of that continuing and ultimately having a political expression by political freedom, it has turned. Xi basically has moved us into great authoritarianism over the last 5 years or so, and it's only going to get worse. Even my optimism about China. I used to love Hong Kong. Look where Hong Kong is today. It's just under the boot of the Chinese authorities. I don't know where to look to be optimistic. I'm eager to find out from you guys, maybe. Yeah.
Can I just ask about what you're saying about suffering?
Yeah.
And I think it's quite interesting. When you talk about suffering, I would actually say it's probably more, especially bring it back to Scotland.
Yeah.
You not say that perhaps in Scotland, where you talk about those hates, and there's these anti-hate laws that exist. There's, there's I'd say more of a welfare state in Scotland even, in the fact that services run better, things are put on for you, provided for you more than they are in the rest of the country. But I'd say, just talking about the suffering, I do actually think it's more of there's a complete aversion to suffering at all in the UK, and particularly in Scotland. I think it's actually more that no one can suffer, no one should suffer. And I mean, you say even the fact that the government is dishing out money to everyone no matter what to cover their energy costs. Like 40, 50 years ago in the 70s, where there were all massive energy costs, that would be unthinkable.
Yes.
Now no one can suffer at all. I think that's quite, especially good.
There's a sense that that's true, but I know this doesn't sound like suffering, but when somebody sticks their hand in my pocket and takes 50% of my income, I'm suffering. Right? It's mine. They just took 50% of it. That's a lot of my energy, my time, my effort, my focus, what I do in life is I try to produce stuff and create stuff, and yet they took 50%. But that's fine, because I'm successful. I'm already wealthy, so I'm allowed to suffer. The people who are not allowed to suffer, the people who are not fine, right? They're not allowed to suffer. So it's a redistribution, if you will, of that. But it's also the case that, yes, while from an economic perspective, the modern welfare state has made sure that nobody suffers too much economically, right? Most poor in the West are taken care of, at least to some minimal level, right? Then we have to look for other people who are suffering. So we find other ways to express suffering. So a lot of people declare that they're suffering just because they have a different color skin. And by definition, they were oppressed 200 years ago, so they're suffering right now. Their ancestors were oppressed, so they must be suffering right now. Right? Middle-class kids who just happen to have, coming from, and some of them coming from wealthy families, but their color skin is different, and they're now on this intersectionality somewhere. Or, so we create new problems in order to create new people who are suffering. Because we can't tolerate a world, really, morally. We have to sacrifice to somebody. So if they're not suffering economically, we have to find other forms of suffering. And I think a lot of what we're doing to our teenage kids is encourage them to not be themselves, but to find something where they can associate with, with depression and suffering, and you're seeing kids do crazy things around gender that makes no sense, and in groups, and why? So I think we shift our focus in terms of suffering to other areas, because we've, in a sense, in the West, solved the economic side of suffering through redistribution of wealth, right? But we've supposedly solved it. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was more just like jumping off the previous question, but isn't it, the suffering isn't, like you kind of answered my point anyway, but the suffering isn't really economic suffering, but in a world where sort of Marxist Hegelian dialectics of oppressor and oppressed, it's a lot sexier to market yourself as the oppressed victimhood person than it is to say, I'm fine.
Yes, if those are the only two options, that's right. So you take away the idea of trade, you take away the idea of human relationships as win-win, and the Marxist and Hegelian approach is, no, there's always an oppressor and there's always an oppressed, right? German Romantic philosophy. There's always an oppressor and always an oppressed. So, so Apple is oppressing me by sending me the iPhone. I don't know it, but I'm really being oppressed by spending $1,000 on the iPhone. Even though I think I'm much better off for buying the iPhone and for having an iPhone, the dialectic tells me, no, you must have been oppressed by them. So yes, so now we have to find other ways to express that oppression, because people don't really buy that they're being oppressed by Apple.
I would say that's what a lot of for me, what a lot of independence arguments is an expression of, and we were speaking about this before we started, that a lot of it feels like I've heard Scottish people refer to Scotland as a colonised country, and then it's a colonised people, and I've heard people in a seminar liken the Scottish experience of being in a union to enslaved and colonised people, which is like insulting and laughable and awful. But I think it comes down to the idea that they can either market themselves as being part of the oppressed, or they've got to accept that they are part of Britain. And if you're part of Britain, then you're obviously
an oppressor.
Coloniser, thief.
No, that's right. So this is the binary of oppressor and oppressor versus the alternative of a trader, the alternative of a free individual making choices. And this is the thing about collectivism versus individualism. When you think about collectives don't trade, but you can view easily collectives as oppressor or oppressed. But yeah, there's a competition always to be the oppressed, not just because of dialectic, but also just because of Christianity. Oppressed is virtue. To be successful, to have stuff, whether it's wealth or whether it's just happiness or whether it's just being a human being that is good with himself, there's no virtue in that. There is in an Aristotelian framework, but there's no virtue of that in a Christian framework. You had a question?
No, you covered it.
Yep.
In the context of, what's the word, people who need help in society, and the endless search for other people who need help, endlessly down and down and down and down and down. It never seems to be ending.
It's never an end.
So, what do you think about the proposal that it's not really welfare for the suffering, because nobody has any interest in the suffering? Because if you did have any serious interest in those who suffer, you would just institute capitalism, and everyone would become super wealthy, and we'd all be, in 50 years, it'll all be over. We'd all go home, turn the lights out.
Well, we could, a lot earlier than 50 years, yes.
We'd all go home.
Yeah.
Now, so is the whole welfare debate really just another facet of unearned power and authority, where it's really welfare for those in the state, who just keep this whole ball rolling, where the government, the elected officials, people administering unearned power are just on this sort of gravy train, which must keep going.
There's no question that that's part of it, but I think philosophically, altruism was never about the suffering. Altruism was about penalizing the successful.
Yeah.
That's what drives it ideologically. We're not really interested in helping the poor people. We're not, because to help the poor people is easy. We're not really interested in solving problems. What we're interested in is knocking down the successful. What we're interested in is penalizing the people who are happy and living a good life. That's what's unacceptable philosophically and socially. And what the politicians do is they capitalize on that. They create a gravy train for themselves, capitalize off of the cultural idea that we need to knock them down, we need to pull them down. And you can see that, I know we can't get into a whole debate about this, but think about the way we treat, in America at least, the way we treat 19th century industrialists. We call them robber barons. I mean, where would America be today if not for those industrialists? They built the country, they created it, they made it. There is no America without those industrialists. And I would venture to say, even though I'm not an expert, that is absolutely the case here in the UK. Right? The 19th century is the most important century in all of human history from the perspective of human well-being. We went from being dirt poor, life expectancy of 35 or 39 maybe in the UK, child mortality at 50% before the age of 10, to doubling life expectancy, to increasing the population, to eating better, to child mortality going down, all within a span of 1 century, and we hate that century. We think the Industrial Revolution is no plague upon the earth. And we hate the people who made it possible, those evil industrialists. And that has nothing to do with helping the suffering. Nothing has helped the suffering more than capitalism has, than industrialization. Nothing in all of human history did more for suffering than the Industrial Revolution. Nothing. And yet, here in England, you hate the Industrial Revolution. England, in Scotland, in the whole UK. I mean, the way it started schools, it's the most evil, horrific, dark period in all of human history. Shockingly, at the beginning of that century, almost no children went to school. By the end of the century, all children went to school. Wow! Shouldn't you celebrate that transition? No. No, because a bunch of people got rich. And they were successful. And they did it themselves. It wasn't a state that did it. It wasn't a group that did it. It wasn't a collective that did it. Individuals went out there and changed the world. And that is unacceptable. And that needs to be knocked down. We knock it down in the history books, and then we knock it down politically. But that's what it's about. It's about pulling people down. Look at what the Chinese did to Jack Ma. They've learned from us. Jack Ma changed China. He should be a hero. Celebrated here. I don't know if you know Jack Ma, but he's the guy behind Alibaba. And he changed China, and he employed millions, hundreds of thousands, made income possible for millions and millions of people. He changed the world, but he pissed off the people in charge, and he was knocked down, and many Chinese cheered them on. Because that's the culture we've created. We've created a culture that knocks down people who are successful. We want to make them into villains. We don't like success. We don't like happiness.
We've made production immoral.
Yes, we made happiness immoral. We made success immoral. It's not just, by the way, I don't think it's just in economics. I think it's in every realm of our lives. We made success, achievement, bad. Something that needs to be, you need to penalize people for. I mean, in schools, in America at least, I mean, there's this whole trend not to give grades, give everybody a ribbon, treat everybody the same when we're not the same. This is the philosophy of egalitarianism. Knock down the able. And we know where that leads. It leads to the killing fields of Cambodia.
It's here too. It's in our schools. It's in our secondary schools.
Yes. And we invest a huge amount in helping the slow learners. We ignore the brilliant, at least in America. But the brilliant are the ones who are going to change the world. But we ignore them. All right. Thank you, everybody.